Good morning, everyone. As we think through these last handful of weeks, as we've been discussing people who Jesus interacted with in the Bible, whose names we don't know, I'd like for us to think back on some of the intimate moments Jesus had with some of these people. In the first week of this series, we discussed this former demoniac who Mark says was possessed by not just one demon, but a legion of demons. And we told the whole story about the pigs and going down into the water, and how this man who previously had never worn clothes because of the demonic possession was sitting with Jesus, dressed and in his right mind. And he was pleading with Jesus, saying, "Let me follow you." And then I believe what this intimate moment takes place where Jesus has a somewhat unexpected response and says, "No. You stay here and tell your family all that the Lord has done for you." The next week, Gilbert walked us through this interaction Jesus had with a woman who had been suffering from a physical ailment for 12 years and had lost all of her money trying to get well. And she sees Jesus in some crowds. And this is just shortly after the demoniac episode when Jesus had crossed by boat back over to the west side of the Sea of Galilee. And she thinks, if I can just touch his clothes. And Jesus realizes that power has gone out from him. He says, "Who touched me?" His disciples say, "How can you ask who touched you? There's so many people here." And she confesses, and Jesus has this intimate moment. He doesn't call her by her name. He calls her daughter. Shay, the next week, walked us through this interaction Jesus had with not only a woman at the well, sitting at a well, but a Samaritan woman. And Jesus had intimate knowledge of her life. And she was amazed. And she said, she went back to a lot of other Samaritans, and she said, "Come and listen to this person who told me everything I ever did." And then Jesus ended up spending a couple of days with them because of this intimate interaction they had. Last week, Gilbert talked about this man at the pool of Bethesda who had been suffering from a physical disability that prevented him from walking for what sounds like 38 years. And Jesus asks him this intimate question. He says, "Do you want to get well?" Some people have called that a silly question or a stupid question, and we know it's not. It's a serious question. Do you want to get well after all these years of being in this condition? Death is an intimate thing too, isn't it? There's many of us in this room who have been close to loved ones in the final moments of their earthly life. I love this painting by a Russian artist portraying the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. You can see the anguish, the torment. Look now at the criminal on the left side of the painting. Consider his facial expression. While he's looking over at Jesus, what do you read on his face? There's a lot we don't know about this individual. We definitely don't know a lot more than we know. He's oftentimes referred to as a thief. The word in Luke uses doesn't necessarily indicate thief, it indicates criminal. Some scholars speculate that he was a revolutionary, speculate that maybe he was guilty of murdering someone as part of a revolution, and whatever he did, we know that the crime was fitting so that the Romans wanted to make an example of his crime. That's why he was sentenced to die by crucifixion. Romans, they did that to people who they wanted to put on display and make an example of. There were definitely other methods of death, of execution that the Romans used. Crucifixion was definitely the most public one, and also the most prolonged and public one. And so, whatever he's done, it's worthy of a public execution in the mind of the Romans, of the Roman authority. There's a lot of ways to think about what led to this occurrence, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ between two criminals. This was not the first time that people tried to kill Jesus. If you remember, you can read about in John, there were times when the religious leaders were so infuriated with claims Jesus made about himself that they tried to capture him in order to stone him to death, and he disappeared from their midst. This time, though, Jesus, he could have disappeared. He could have gotten out of this. There's lots of ways he could have gotten out of this, and including miraculous ways. But he surrendered to this because this time it was his Father's will and not the will of just people. What I want to focus on today is the shame aspect of this crucifixion. When Jesus is on trial, you read the text, you can hear the mob gathered there shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." And again, like I mentioned, there were several other methods of death they could have chosen. But they were shouting, "Crucify him, crucify him." That's the pressure they're putting on because the religious leaders were hoping that the Romans would put Jesus on display. The things that he had done to offend them, they never wanted to see done again. They did not believe he was the Messiah, and they didn't like the heresy that in their mind he was spreading. So let's focus on the shame aspect of crucifixion today. And as Nikki reads these words from Luke 23 that are going to be scrolling by on the screen, really reflect on the shame that, in this instance, Jesus and the criminal were experiencing during their deaths.
2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. The people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, "He saved others. Let him save himself if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one." The soldiers also came up and mocked him. They offered him wine vinegar and said, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was a written notice above him which read, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God?" he said. "Since you are under the same sentence, we are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "Truly, today you will be with me in paradise."
Thank you, Nikki. I'd like for you to take a moment and think about the most excruciating physical pain you've ever felt in your life. When we think of the cross and the suffering of the cross, our mind often goes to physical agony first, and for good reason. The word we use, that I just use, excruciating, actually comes from the word crucifixion. There's lots of ways to get into talking about just how painful physically painful a crucifixion would be, even more so for Jesus than for others, because of things that they did to Jesus, that they didn't do to the other people. Today, though, like I said, let's think about the shame of the crucifixion. And what I want to argue is that in that culture, shame and the physical agony were on the same level in terms of thinking about crucifixion. So we're going to talk about two layers of shame. The first level of shame when it comes to the crucifixion, two layers of shame when it comes to crucifixion. The first one we're going to talk about is communal, and then in the next one we're going to talk about the individual and try to get a little more personal. A communal shame when it comes to crucifixion. This is the first known piece of art that depicts the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And I'm not going to read the little editor's note from the book of artwork that I have there, but you can read it if you like. They speculate that this is somewhere from around year 410 to 420, 430, somewhere in there. And it's commonly believed among scholars that there is earlier artwork. There is earlier Christian artwork. This is the first piece of Christian art depicting the crucifixion. And so this is until early 5th century. And so they're wondering, why wait that long? Why do we have such a gap between when this movement began, between the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ and artwork depicting the crucifixion of Jesus Christ? And it's often, thought that because of the shame aspect of crucifixion during that day, they did not think of crucifixion in the same way that we think of crucifixion. And we look around this room, we have 3 crosses in this room. We have one up here on stage, we have one in that corner, we have one in this corner. We have a cross on the top of our building. Sharon showed me this morning that it's on your wrist, right? The cross on your wrist. There's probably other people in here who have beautiful tattoos of the cross on their body. And we are proud of the cross. We put it on t-shirts, right? The earliest Jesus followers were not proud that Jesus died in that manner because of the stigma related to crucifixion during that time. I love how Fleming Rutledge says it. I'm going to move over here to read this quote in her book about understanding the death of Jesus Christ. She says, "Until the gospel of Jesus Christ burst upon the Mediterranean world, no one in the history of human imagination had conceived of such a thing as the worship of a crucified man. The early Christian preaching announced the entrance of God upon the stage of history in the person of an itinerant Jewish teacher who had been ingloriously pinned up alongside 2 of society's cast-offs to die horribly, discarded onto the garbage heap of humanity, scornfully forsaken by both elites and common folk, leaving behind only a discredited, demoralized handful of scruffy disciples who had no status whatsoever in the eyes of anyone." So there's scholars who suspect that the earliest Christians were not proud not wanting to proclaim that Jesus died by the manner of crucifixion. Even though they might boast in his death, crucifixion was hard for them to get their minds wrapped around because of that stigma. And so some biblical hints at it as well. In Romans chapter 1, when Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that's left to ask, why the need to issue such a disclaimer? Paul, writing to the Romans, probably assumed that they understand exactly what he's saying, why he would need to say, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of this account of Jesus' life. There's another place you can go to in Corinthians where it may not be as clear to them exactly what Paul's talking about. And so Paul spells it out more for the Corinthians, which we're not going to get into as much today. Likely, the common agreement is that Paul's talking about he's not ashamed of the cross of Jesus Christ. In Philippians chapter 2, Paul has this beautiful portion of text where he talks about Jesus. He says, Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. And most of my life I've thought of those words, even death on a cross, and I've thought of the physical agony, but maybe Paul is talking about even death on a cross. Also, he's much referring to the shame that comes with being crucified. And from Hebrews chapter 12, and what I've done here on the screen is put in any English translation that might fit for this word we have in there. You know, the Hebrew writer is saying, let us keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who endured the cross. And so then we have this word that sometimes is despising, sometimes scorning. So Jesus despised its shame, endured the cross, despising its shame, scorning its shame. Some of the literal translations that don't really flow well, but are more literal translations, thought against its shame, showed active insult against the shame of the cross, endured it, all those hours, all that agony, all that shame, in spite of its shame. Now let's go to a second layer of shame when it comes to crucifixion, and that's for the individual. And so now I'd like for you to think from the perspective of the criminal on the cross dying next to Jesus. And I want you to put yourself in his position as best as you can. And imagine you live in a true shame and honor culture. Now, in some ways, of course, we still live in a shame and honor culture. None of us really love shame. But imagine you live in a shame and honor culture where the common thought is if you had to choose between death and bringing shame upon yourself and in your family, most of the people in your culture would probably choose death. And imagine that you've been arrested and you are in custody of an authority that you do not trust. And that your death sentence is crucifixion. Again, the most public and most inefficient manner of death that the Romans can think of. And on the day that your death sentence is going to be carried out, which for the criminal on the cross, I just want to speculate that perhaps he did not know the day was coming, and that they decided to do it on the day that it came up that they were going to crucify Jesus, and because they said, let's put him between two criminals too, just to add to Jesus' shame. And so they're using you to try to further defame Jesus. Let's not only crucify him, let's crucify him between two criminals. And on the day of your death sentence, the authority you do not trust either forcefully removes all of your clothes or forces you to remove all of your clothes and takes you out into a very, very public place and hoists you up high for everyone to see, but it's so close that they see you and you're able to see them, people you likely know, looking back at you. Close enough to have a conversation. Those paintings we have of the crucifixion where the artist has added some type of cloth covering Jesus' midsection, that's the artist being nice. The Romans didn't care about anyone's modesty that they were executing. And so as your death sentence is being carried out, toward the end, not only are you close enough to all these spectators, but you're also close enough to Jesus to have a conversation. And at this point, toward the end, it must be very hard for both of you to talk, to speak, to gather the air. And you make this request of Jesus. Remember me in your kingdom. And as Nikki read so well, Jesus says these words in the midst of all this shame, this physical agony. Jesus says, today, let's focus on each part of this sentence. Today, you will be with me in paradise. I hope sometime soon we have a series where we can walk through focusing a few weeks on eternity and break this down a little bit more, but today we'll just take it for its beauty as it is. Truly today, you will be with me in paradise. The thought I'd like to end with today, as we look forward to what's coming later this week and our celebration next week, is that what we're looking at, the love, the passion, the suffering, the agony, the shame, the compassion, the endurance. This is an incomplete picture of our salvation. And I'm not trying to say that in order to have any shock value or to be edgy at all. But oftentimes we in our culture, we are so proud of the cross, and for good reason. It is a part of our salvation. But Paul, writing to the Corinthians who had begun to doubt the reality of the resurrection of Jesus Christ after Jesus was fully dead, they had begun to doubt that he was able to come back to life in human form. Paul says to them, if the resurrection didn't happen, our preaching to you has been in vain. If the resurrection didn't happen, your faith, Paul says, is meaningless. If the resurrection didn't happen, you and me, Paul says, we are still in our sin. Without the resurrection of Jesus Christ, this is merely the death of the best man who ever lived. Let's think about that, reflect on that as we look forward to next week.